I just want to say who is co-hosting this event. It's Greater Manchester and District CND, the Nuclear Free Local Authorities, Mayors for Peace in Manchester, Chernobyl Children's Project UK, and Beyond Nuclear. So, Sean, over to you, please.
Thank you, Jackie. And just on behalf of the organising committee, I'd like to thank Maxine for a beautiful reading there. As Jackie says, I'm the Secretary of the UK and Ireland Nuclear Free Local Authorities and also of the Mayors of Peace organisation. Now, Chernobyl is one of 4 places that I spend most of my week working on, either 3 are Fukushima, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And for the last 35 years, we've been very involved in getting to understand what happened, working out its impacts on Europe and on the world, getting the experts to talk about the impacts that continue and will continue for many thousands of years afterwards. And so we're really delighted to be involved in this event today. We've had many of the political leaders speak at some of our events in the past. We've had people speak on behalf of Mikhail Gorbachev, and I remember him speaking about explaining how he set up Green Cross International as a result of the Chernobyl disaster, because he never wanted to see an environmental disaster dealt with in the way Chernobyl was. We have many other speakers we've had involved in this incident and talked to us about some of the great and difficult effects, really. But I'm very pleased that today we're going to talk about the human impacts. We just heard directly what those impacts were and how terrifying they must have been for the people concerned. We're going to hear today from 3 speakers who've really looked and get involved in these issues. I'm delighted to hear, I'm looking forward to hear what they say. One of the speakers you'll hear from is Linda Walker from Chernobyl Children's Project. And for the last 30 years, we've supported them. We helped at their founding conference at Manchester Town Hall, led by the Mayor of Manchester. And we're delighted to help all the children that have come over from Belarus to the UK for recuperative holidays. And we're very interested to hear what they're doing today. I don't want to keep the mic for very long, but I do want to advertise another event that's going on tomorrow. We are working with our European partners, the Alliance of Regions, for the phase out of nuclear power in Europe, and INRAG on a major academic conference that's going to look at aging reactors in Europe. There are over 125 reactors in Europe that are over 33 years old or more. Many of whom have got many problems, and tomorrow's conference is going to look at that. If you're interested in registering for that conference, if you go to our website, www.nuclearpolicy.info, you can get the registration details. So I'm really pleased to be here. I hope we have a really interesting session. I'd like to pass over now to Linda Pence Gunter to moderate today's session and webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Jackie, and thank you so much, Maxine, as well. Can't fail to be moved every time you hear those stories, first-person accounts. I'm Linda Pence Gunter with Beyond Nuclear, a US-based nonprofit advocating for an end to nuclear power and nuclear weapons. And some of you may also be familiar with our Beyond Nuclear International website as well. So before I introduce our wonderful guests, I'd like to pause for a moment and remember a remarkable British actor, Paul Ritter, who died on April 5th from a brain tumor. If you saw the Chernobyl series on television, you will remember Paul as Anatoly Dyatlov, the plant's deputy chief engineer, who oversaw and was largely blamed for the catastrophic explosion and meltdown at Unit 4. It was an unforgettable performance. It was that series, Chernobyl, which did so much to raise awareness about the nuclear disaster that got us thinking about how we tell the Chernobyl story and how effective the arts can be in communicating it. We realized that what the Chernobyl series did so well, among many things, was to bring the lived experience to life. Yes, the accident was a technical failure, but it was really about people. And watching that series, we were able to step inside their lives and feel what they felt as that terrible disaster unfolded. But there were, of course, so many more who suffered. Our guests today have all told those stories in very different ways, so let's introduce them. Kate Brown is a historian and author who wrote the page-turning Manual for Survival, A Chernobyl Guide to the Future, received to great acclaim in March 2019. It is a meticulously researched expose about the true extent of the health impacts, in particular, of the Chernobyl accident and the efforts to cover up that evidence. Welcome, Kate. Darragh McKeon began his professional career as a theatre director in Ireland, but started spending his evenings writing what was to become his first breakout novel, All That Is Solid Melts into Air. Set during and after the Chernobyl accident, it follows the lives of ordinary people in Russia and Belarus, all of whom find their lives upended and even ended, either directly or indirectly due to the Chernobyl disaster. So welcome to Darragh. Linda Walker set up Chernobyl Children's Project UK in 1995, inspired by Adi Roach's Chernobyl Children International. Although she planned to follow Adi's lead in bringing affected children out of the former Soviet Union for radiation vacations, she quickly also turned her organization into a humanitarian aid effort focused on Belarus, bringing much needed supplies to children and families in Belarus as well. So welcome to Linda Walker and to all our guests. So Darragh, I want to begin with you. Some of the imagined characters in your novel are clearly drawn from the testimonials Svetlana Alexievich collected, as we just heard in the readings. If you've read both books, you'll recognize the overlap. As I recall, you had not been to the former Soviet Union when you wrote your book. Did those stories inspire you to write it, or what made you choose Chernobyl as the anchor of your first novel?
Yes, I did to a certain extent draw on some of the stories that Svetlana Alexievich came up with, or there's some of the witness testimony that she put together. But that was quite late in the process. For me, I think the starting point, you've mentioned that Linda is part of Chernobyl Children's Fund. The Irish version of that is run by a lady called Adi Roach. And so when I was, talking about my book and kind of doing book tours and speaking in various countries, people were quite surprised that an Irish person was writing about Chernobyl. But actually any events that I did here, people aren't at all surprised, because it's actually quite a present issue within our country, simply because, or, largely because of the work of Adi Roach and her organization. So for example, I'm from a very small town in the middle of Ireland called Tullamore, which is about I grew up, it's a town of about 10,000 people, but we would have had Chernobyl children come and stay, in our town most summers. And they were quite present actually. And it's the kind of town, it's not a place that people tend to visit. We didn't get a vast tourism put through. So, some of these Chernobyl children were some of the first foreigners that I'd ever met. And we do kind of little small kind of cultural events in the pub, or in kind of community centers, and so there was a little bit of an exchange of cultures and a little bit of an understanding of who these people were, but again, I certainly had no idea of the Soviet Union, of any of the Soviet history. We had a kind of very scant idea of what the accident comprised of, but again, not really. So I think later in my life, I began to come around to that time again and decided to just begin to research into the subject and into the event. And very quickly as I did, the material, I just found the material so compelling. Chernobyl is, the TV series thankfully has kind of brought a wider awareness of some of the complexities of the issue to the greater world. At the time that I was reading, we all had an understanding of the word Chernobyl. We had a very basic understanding of something happened, and yet, despite the fact that it was a massive global event, not a lot had been written about it, certainly from a fictional point of view. So, kind of all of these things, inherent in the subject is there is a kind of a tension that does come with radioactivity and nuclear power, in that we have a sense as human beings that it's very destructive, and yet it's difficult to trace that. It's not like a bombing, or it's not like a terrorist event, because very often, certainly in cases of chronic radiation, it is something that gradually happens over a long period of time. I suppose the difference between our instinctual sense of something being awry and the actual specific evidence that shows up, you know, often in that disjunct, there's a very deep and interesting tension. And so these are the kinds of things that I was coming across as I was doing my research and reading. But gradually, yeah, I suppose it gradually was a process that I didn't decide necessarily to write a book about Chernobyl, but as I began to read about it and be compelled about it, it was a story I decided I did really want to tell.
Well, Kate, in contrast, you were already familiar with the place and the language, a natural advantage in researching the subject. But before you began your research, did you already expect that there'd been a whitewash of the facts about Chernobyl, or were you surprised at what you uncovered?
I was quite surprised. I'd spent a good 20 years in Ukraine and Russia, going around to these villages, and I heard lots of people in the 1990s talk about Chernobyl problems, and I read about this in my book. I had the kind of prejudices of a Western foreigner, and I was listening to the press, poo-pooing, minimizing the Chernobyl health effects, and I sort of thought these people were just sort of whining that they had, what sounded like normal complaints, and they were attributing them to radioactivity. So, like fast forward another 15 years later, I find myself finishing a book about the first 2 plutonium plants in the world, and the Soviet one in the southern Urals of Siberia and the American one in the American West. And farmers outside of both of those plutonium plants kept telling me about their health problems and pointing to the plutonium plants as a reason for their health problems. And when I asked the scientists around those sites, they'd say, oh, those farmers, they don't even have a high school education. They probably drink too much, smoke too much, and everything they want to blame on radiation, that kind of stuff. So I couldn't get much in that book, Plutopia. I couldn't get much. There were military sites about health effects. And so when I finished that, I wasn't satisfied with the story I had written. And I thought, well, I'll go to the Chernobyl records because that was a civilian site. It happened later. So in 2014, I showed up in Kiev and I asked for the records, the archival records from the Ministry of Health on Chernobyl. And the archivist said, you won't find anything because that was a banned topic during the Soviet period. I said, well, listen, I've come all this way. Why don't we just take a look? And it didn't take a great sleuth. Within a few minutes, we had huge document collections filed in plain Ukrainian that says the medical consequences of the Chernobyl catastrophe. And I looked at them, these archivists, and I realized they weren't trying to deceive me, but nobody had asked for these files. And for an archivist, if the files haven't been pooled, they don't know they exist until somebody goes searching for them. So what I found was, the Soviets said, the leaders said, we had 300 people hospitalized, and some of those, Alexeyevich is so movingly writing about because of Chernobyl exposures. But what I found in our count, that was just from one hospital in Moscow that dealt with radiation medicine. If you looked at all the hospitals, we counted 40,000 people hospitalized from Chernobyl exposures in just the summer after the accident, 11,000 of whom were children. And it was at that point when I realized the magnitude of these exposures, not immediately in the Chernobyl zone where the HBO show looks, where a lot of these dramas focus on, and the control room and the plant itself, but in the wider rural landscape surrounding the Chernobyl zone. That's where the real drama played out. And that's where I focused my book, Manual for Survival. And so to make sure I had this story straight, I knew it would be a problem for me to be reporting big medical problems right after the accident, recorded in real time. We ended up going to 27 archives to track this story.
Incredible. No. Well, Linda, as a person and especially as a mother, did the Chernobyl accident change you in some way and inspire you to activism, or were you already engaged? And why the children of Belarus particularly?
Well, I've been active in the anti-nuclear movement since the early 80s. Initially just nuclear weapons, but quite quickly realized that nuclear power was almost as great a problem. So when the Chernobyl disaster took place in 1986, I was the coordinator of a small peace group, and we organized a debate within a week of the accident. I remember we had a speaker from British Nuclear Fuels who made light of it, made jokes about radiation, And of course, that's been the pattern ever since, that the nuclear industry and the pro-nuclear governments have made out that there were very few deaths and very few problems. But it was some years later when I was involved in organising an international peace festival in Manchester that Adi Roach came to speak and showed her brilliant film Black Wind, White Land. And I suggested that as a follow-up to our festival, we could invite some children over for a holiday. So Adi took me out to Belarus with her just a few months later, and I met some of the liquidators talking about all their health problems. I met doctors in the hospitals, parents with very sick children, parents and grandparents who were so grateful for the holidays that their children had in Ireland or Italy or other parts of Europe, said what a fantastic difference it had made to their health. With the help of nuclear-free local authorities, as Sean said, we launched the charity early the following year, started to bring children for holidays and to deliver humanitarian aid. And initially, we were going to work also in Ukraine and Russia, but we quite quickly established so many contacts and so many projects within Belarus, which is the country which was most heavily affected by Chernobyl, that it made sense to focus on Belarus. So the children we invited in the early years were children who lived in some of the contaminated villages. Most of them had not had any major health problems, but they all had damaged immune systems, and the holiday was a possibility to improve their immune systems and give them a better chance of staying healthy. But in more recent years, we've brought children in remission from cancer, particularly the teenagers who never get invited to other countries. And we also have many projects in Belarus, particularly supporting children with disabilities.
Well, you touch on obviously the sort of the downplay and the cover up and the whitewash, and Kate, your book really did give the lie to the established narrative, which many of us, of course, for years have tried to push back against, that almost no one died as a result of Chernobyl. How do you think that false narrative became so well established, and what kind of pressure have you felt with efforts to try to undermine and negate your findings?
Well, what confused me as I worked through the archives is, and what became clear, I think, part of the problem is that, Soviets had socialized medicine. And so they counted all the time, just automatically, how many people are sick, and they report it from the counties that would go up to the province to the republics, and then to the federal government. But the problem we find is that the Soviets, said the Soviet population is getting healthier and happier every day. And so for a public health official to say, in fact, we see this trajectory of kids with pernicious anemia, enlarged thyroids, women with fertility problems, women who are not able to carry full term. We have this rising number of leukemias. We have rising numbers of people with autoimmune, cardiac and digestive tract and respiratory tract disorders. These numbers are climbing up from 1986 as a distinct difference. And by 1989, there's a real alarm spreading. And so as those charts go higher up the hierarchy, they get cleaned of the message. So often the Moscow public health officials are getting a much sunnier, rosier picture. So that's part of the problem, is Moscow's not getting very good feedback. But I also noticed that as foreign officials come in, and the Russian officials in Moscow were having trouble managing this story by 1989, so they called the World Health Organization. They said, can you do an independent assessment by foreign experts? And that word foreign experts had like a magical appeal in the Soviet Union because they weren't trusting their own scientists. And so the World Health sent in 3 physicists for 10 days, and they traveled around the Chernobyl contaminated territories. And after 10 days, they said, we don't see any health problems. We think Moscow could double or triple the dose they prescribed. And we think those officials, those doctors in Belarus that are saying that there's health problems, we think they're terrible scientists and you should discipline them. So what can 3 physicists do in 10 days? The World Health Organization basically discredited itself. And so then Moscow asked the International Atomic Energy Agency to do a foreign assessment. And so I followed, to the archives to get this story in UN archives. And International Atomic Energy Agency said, if we do the assessment, it will look biased because we are a nuclear lobby promoting peaceful uses of nuclear energy. So we'll set up a kind of a fictitious interagency task force. IEA still ran it, and they did a longer study, 18 months, but they said the exact same thing. We see a lot of health problems in these contaminated areas, but nothing related to Chernobyl exposures. Because if you look at Hiroshima, at these doses, we would predict that there'd be no problems related to radiation. What I found is that some doctors, a Ukrainian doctor, had given Fred Metler, the head of this study, 20 biopsies. And she said, listen, these kids have thyroid cancer. We've been telling you this. If you don't believe it, take this evidence home. So he took it home. He gave it to his lab in New Mexico. They all checked out. In his report, he wrote, there has been rumors of pediatric thyroid cancers. Those rumors are anecdotal in nature. So, these kinds of things we see that in both from the Moscow end and from the international scientists working as consultants to the UN end, we see this sort of cleaning up of evidence as it gets higher and higher. And then when it's finally publicized and spoken to the public, these enunciations of, there are health problems. We think they're psychological in nature. We think that these people are smoking and drinking alcohol and have poor diets, and they're too anxious. But we don't see any problems from radiation.
It's interesting that you mention a doctor trying to get the truth out, because Darragh, in your book, your doctor character, Grigory, also pushes back against the false narrative and tries to alert people to the danger and to get the truth out about what he saw while treating Chernobyl patients, but he's rebuffed and even rejected by his best friend. Did you also conclude through the research for your novel that what was solid, as it were, about the true impacts of Chernobyl was allowed to melt into air and just sort of disappear, replaced by this official downplayed version, which we're more familiar with?
Yeah, that character actually was largely based on a physicist called Viktor Roswell, who was very, carried quite a lot of authority as regards the cleanup. I mean, when I started reading about the scientists who were involved in it and who were directly involved in the aftermath of the accident and the cleanup of the accident, one of the things that becomes very apparent is their sense of guilt. They're also placed into a situation where there has been, quite literally, an unprecedented event, and yet they have to, in some way, corral this event or guide the treatment or the initial kind of treatment that happens. So that, I mean, that's a very intriguing situation where they are placed in this situation where literally they have no idea what to do, and this authority is given to them. Quite a few of them later on, Viktor Roswell actually ended up taking his own life in the years after the cleanup, just largely because, and he's written very eloquently, his wife actually wrote a beautiful kind of testimony to his life, including some diary extracts that came out in Pravda maybe 5 to 10 years after his death. But the sense that carries, I suppose, for me, the sense that carried was interesting in terms of these people being placed in this very unprecedented situation, and also being aware of how their previous work and their inability to push against the system, or unwillingness to push against the system, in some way led to this event. There was a week or two after Chernobyl, I think that happened was there was an international conference actually held in the region, and the prime minister at the time was called Rykosov, and he arrived, this is still within Soviet times, but he arrived there and made a speech to say that this event was inevitable, which was a very surprising thing, and for a Soviet politician to say at the time. But if you look at the practices and you look at the kind of safety standards that they had, it's quite easy to conclude that. So a lot of the kind of medical experts carried an awful lot of guilt with them, and I found that very compelling.
Well, I think some of us would argue that an accident at a nuclear power plant, period, is inevitable, just
Yeah.
because of the inherent dangers, you know, and they were compounded by some particular circumstances, obviously, around Chernobyl. And Linda, you've talked about how little is still really known and understood about the true and persistent health and societal impacts of Chernobyl. What do you think is the biggest missing message that people need to hear to better understand the magnitude of these negative impacts? And maybe you'd like to also address the recent study that was just announced yesterday about effects on children in particular, quite controversial. I'm sure you'd like to comment on that as well.
Well, Kate's book did so much to make it clear what the massive health impacts of the accident were. There have been so many media attempts over the years and so many reports produced trying to show that there were very few health effects. Even the thyroid cancers, which were obvious very quickly. The Americans in particular spent years trying to prove that thyroid cancers weren't linked to Chernobyl. And then when they had to say they were, they said, oh, but they don't matter really because hardly anybody dies from thyroid cancer. But most of the other cancers are still not acknowledged, and all the other health problems. There have been reports about the number of heart problems, children with diabetes, children born with disabilities, which definitely rose very significantly in the contaminated parts of the country after the accident. And of course, in more recent years, it's been the effects on the children of those who were affected by the accident and by the ongoing impact of eating contaminated food and breathing contaminated air. And speaking to doctors in the cancer hospital, there's been a very significant rise in recent years in the number of babies diagnosed with leukemia or other cancers. And we have a hospice team in Gomel, and I've worked often with the Belarusian Children's Hospice in Minsk. And there are many, many families with children with all sorts of genetic disorders, some of which must be linked to Chernobyl. So this study has just been produced, which says that there are no DNA effects on future generations of people affected by the radiation. And it's going to take people with more expertise than me to properly analyze that study, but it seems it was a very limited number of people. We don't know which sort of liquidators they looked at, whether they were people who'd had very significant doses or not. They looked at some families within 45 miles of the plant, but the contamination varies fantastically. And it's not even just the level of contamination. As Kate's book describes, if people live in some of the very marshy areas, the radionuclides are really soaked up into all the food, and particularly into all the wild animals and mushrooms and berries. So you've got to look at the people who acquired more contamination. And there have been previous studies which have shown that for liquidators or people who receive significant doses, there was a real difference in the DNA of children born to them after the accident compared to their siblings born before the accident. But the BBC and others don't pounce on reports like that and tell everybody that, see, here's the proof that Chernobyl wasn't really a problem. So I think people need to be aware that it was a massive problem for the health of people in Belarus. It continues to be, and nobody really knows what's going to happen in future generations. So it's important that people don't forget the families and the children living in the contaminated areas, and that hopefully after COVID, when things get a little bit more back to normal, that children will be able to start coming out again for recuperative holidays here and in other parts of Europe.
Well, yes, I agree with you, Linda. And I just want to remind folks in the audience to do put your questions into the Q&A. I know this is really riveting, so I'm glad everybody's paid attention, but do put your questions in the Q&A. I do want to touch on a couple more things, Jackie, if that's okay, before we go to the audience Q&A that came out of this discussion, both to you, Darragh, and to you, Kate. And I guess, Darragh, you know, you've got two children as lead characters in your book, you know, affected rather differently. One is a Belarusian child who's affected directly, you know, with the story of the door, in fact, is within his family. And then another, the piano prodigy in Moscow, who in a way is living his life you see a sort of slice of life of how he's living as this whole drama unfolds. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, how you decided to choose those two boys and what they meant to you in terms of how you drove the plot lines of the novel?
Yeah, I mean, I've set quite a lot of my novel in Moscow, partly because, you know, reading about Mikhail Gorbachev, when he, you know, talks about his premiership, he does pretty singularly point to Chernobyl as, you know, the beginning of the end, where, you know, his governments became, you know, essentially people began to lose their fear because they could see a government backtracking. So I wanted to kind of give that sense of not only this event happening, but also an entire political system beginning to come apart. I read a new Russian nuclear scientist, you know, as part of kind of early on in my research, speaking about actually what happens on a molecular level in a nuclear reaction is also replicated on a societal level at the end of, you know, at the end of the breaking down of a tradition. So the metaphor that he used was to say that, you know, within a nuclear reaction, essentially it's the breaking down of these kind of assured traditions. So the kind of Moscow characters came out of that. I wanted to show a certain sense of, so there's a piano prodigy in Moscow who loses his sense of timing. And just those kind of very small, when you begin to read about the Soviet history and the breakdown of the Soviet Empire, you can see in very small ways how things begin to become misaligned, and eventually fragmentation happens. With the other characters, Linda actually mentioned the documentary Black Wind, White Land, which was pretty significant for me. I actually remember seeing it on Irish television when I was about 17 or 18. And one of the fascinating things about that was that they would visit farmers in the region who had moved back actually, and would claim that their lands, you know, first of all, they're moving back into highly contaminated lands. A lot of these farmers were very old, and, you know, essentially a lot of the time we're denying the effects of the accident. As I began to do my research more, you know, you do find that radiation particularly affects the young, you know, as our cells are still mutating. You know, as you get a little bit older, you're possibly a little bit more protected from it, or the effects aren't as apparent. But I did find it fascinating that my father is a farmer, and that these people moved back to their agricultural land because a farmer's relationship with land is actually a very deep and very inherent thing. It's not necessarily a job. It's, you know, it's a vocation. It's a way of life. There's a fidelity to that. So some of those farmer characters who return to the plant, we as Westerners or we as outsiders would find that almost abhorrent, that you decide to live in those highly toxic, highly radioactive situations. And yet the farmer part of me does really understand that fidelity to the land, that need to cling to a sense of home.
That's interesting that you raise that, because we're seeing that repeat again with the Fukushima disaster. And there's a brilliant film actually called Nuclear Cattle in English, which talks about the cattle farmers and the need to abandon or not abandon, kill or not kill their animals. Some of them went back and tended them and kept them going, even though they couldn't sell the meat or milk, you know, they had to throw the milk away, and one of them committed suicide as well. So it's an interesting analogy. Last question quickly to you, Kate, sort of circling back to this. There seems to us always be a fixation on deaths, you know, nobody died or only 45 people died at Chernobyl. Fukushima, no one died. And the forgotten masses are all the people who suffer from the many other very serious and traumatic things, health consequences, both in diseases and birth defects and psychological trauma and so forth. Do you have anything you'd like to follow up with on that subject, and as pertains also to this study that just came out, which I think you'd had a chance to look at quickly as well?
Yeah, well, I noticed that Carmel Mothersill is on this call, and she would have something very specific to say about the studies and some earlier studies that were done by some Soviet scientists in England, Dubrova specifically. And we do know so much more about changes at the cellular level to how genes express themselves and how that causes a body to function poorly even before genetic damage kicks in. But one of the things that we have with these studies on people exposed to it, and really the biggest study we have is the atomic bomb survivors, is looking for acute effects, deaths and cancers that kill you. So as Linda pointed out, kids who have easily treatable thyroid cancer are, sort of dismissed, even though if anybody knows a child who's lived and grown into an adult with thyroid cancer, there's nothing easy about that situation. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that other than once this thyroid epidemic became clear, scientists from all over the place rushed in to do studies of that one effect, pediatric thyroid cancer, because scientists get funded when they find positive, effects. Negative effects or open-ended questions are really hard to fund. So the thing to keep in mind is we don't have, when people are denying that there's any Chernobyl health effects, and we see in the archives, a broad spectrum of health problems, subacute health problems that make life miserable. We don't have a study on chronic low doses of radiation, even though scientists right after Chernobyl until today have said Chernobyl was an awful tragedy, but it would be great to do to take this opportunity to do a study on these low dose chronic effects. This after the International Atomic Energy Agency issued its statement in 1991, we see no health effects. We don't expect to see any from Chernobyl in the future. The pledge drive that was going on at the UN General Assembly at the same time failed. They were trying to raise about $1 billion in today's fund. That money was never raised, in large part thanks to that International Chernobyl Project statement saying there's no health effects. So we still need a study. It's not too late. It would be great to have a study. And it would be great to ask open-ended questions at long last about what happened there.
Well, thank you so much for all these great answers. I'm going to hand over to Jackie Burke now, who's been mining into the Q&A. And Jackie, you need to just unmute and go ahead and
Hi, yes, thank you for all of that. We've got quite a few questions. Some maybe I will pull together and ask, because there's a couple, but if we could, Jin or Andrew, if we could find Paul Gunter who would like to ask a question. I think it'd be nice if we can see some people. No, we're not going to be able to do that.
We can't see, okay. But I can allow them to talk. Yeah. So I will do that now for Paul.
Okay, that'd be nice. Paul had a question for Kate.
It might be quicker.
Hi, am I off mute now?
Yes.
Thank you. I was wondering if Kate Brown would make a comment from her book about the deliberate rainout of Chernobyl radioactivity over Belarus.
Yeah, I found that 3 days after the accident, the weather switched and the clouds were now going to move northeast, and there was a big storm front brewing, and it was going to rain radioactive fallout on the big Russian cities, including Moscow. So they sent up some pilots and they flew over those clouds and they let it rain in rural Belarus in order to save urban Russia. Now, that was a triage operation. It exposed a couple 100,000 farmers to save the exposure of millions of people in those cities. The only problem is they didn't tell anyone in Belarus that they had done this, not even the head of the Communist Party of Belarus. And so those people lived, and this is, I think, what Linda is seeing in the projects that she's been working on, is that a lot of these farming families from rural Belarus were sitting there until 1999, the second Chernobyl zone that's nearly as hot as the territory right around the plant in Ukraine, were sitting in this radioactive stew for almost 15 years, consuming their homegrown produce. And this is where we see this huge bouquet of health problems, and a real demographic impact is in that southern Belarusian area. So finally, that area was depopulated in 1999. Very few journalists ever visit that second Chernobyl zone. Disaster tourists don't know it exists. But it's a really big and important part of this story, and those people specifically would make a terrific subjects for a medical study.
Thank you, Kate. We've also got a couple of questions for you again about the false narratives around Chernobyl and the victimization of people and the worried women, as Fukushima, as we were talking about, the worried women of Japan, and whitewashing and gaslighting of women and the other members of those communities. So if you could make a comment on that false narrative, that would be wonderful. Yeah. Thank you.
So much of the Chernobyl denials drew on a long history that comes out of sort of polluting industries, starting with tobacco and lead and chemicals. It falls on the victims themselves who've been exposed to make a case for their exposures. It doesn't fall on the polluters to make a case that their exposures are safe. And so one thing that quickly happens is those people who claim health problems it's turned around and they're blamed for their own lifestyle habits. Their health problems are their own fault because of genetics, because of their drinking and their diet and their personal habits. It was the Soviets at the end of the Soviet Union, especially rural people, were the easiest targets in the world. They were villagers. They didn't have a formal education. They looked funny. They talked in incomprehensible languages. And it was just easy to dismiss them. It was also easy to dismiss the scientists who were on the ground. What I report in my book is 60% of medical professionals had fled these areas by 1988. So the story I'm telling is a diminished story. It probably reflects less than what was actually there because there weren't that many doctors, especially specialists, to record the health problems that they were seeing. The doctors had fled, and the medical staffs, the hospitals were staffed at half staff just 2 years after the accident. So, but those people who had the temerity to stick around and track these stories, these health problems, and talk about their studies, were also maligned as being, the Soviets have bad politics, they have bad economics, and look, their science and their medicine is crappy too. It follows, and so all the Soviet scientists who said, who recorded their work from 5 years of studies on the ground were easily dismissed by this narrative as well.
Thank you very much. Anne Beck just wants to make a comment, really. She wanted to thank you for your book, Kate. She said that she'd been involved with bringing children for 26 years over, and it gave her renewed energy to keep going. So that was a thank you, not a question, but a thank you. And I think that's
well. And I do want to say that those of you who've sponsored Chernobyl Children, is that as I traveled, especially in southern Belarus, people were so grateful that their kids had a chance to see something of the world, and that they had the sense that people cared about their fate. It was really important to keeping them going. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. Dale Dewar said, mentioning the researchers that spent 1.5 years looking at the effects on people. Kate, again, sorry, you're in the spotlight. You name an organisation that did the research so that it would be at arm's length. And he'd been led to believe that it was the IAEA itself that chose the researchers. Do you have any comment on that?
Well, they created something called the International Chernobyl Project, which was an inter-UN agency task force. But it was led by Abel Gonzalez, who was a scientific administrator at the International Atomic Energy Association, and he selected the people to come in for that study. The IAEA is not terribly forthcoming with its records, and so I couldn't see that much that was going on because they've held their records for 30 years rather than every other UN agency holds them for 20 years. But what I notice is when the UN gets a $20 million grant from a Japanese government to do a pilot study, the UN World Health Organization, it's interesting how they select scientists. Rosalie Bertel, who's a scientist and a nun in Canada, she wrote and said, I've done a lot of research on these kinds of problems, and I'd be happy to help your study. Her letter was never answered. So so what World Health does is they draw on the same list of scientists who the IEA was drawing on. And this is the problem we have with radiation medicine, is that so many of these health physicists are people who work for nuclear regulatory agencies, for nuclear power plants, for their industry scientists, and that's where their salaries come from. So a year after the accident, a group of health physicists met in the United States for their annual professional association, summer of 1987. And they were addressed by a lawyer from the US Department of Energy, which makes American nuclear bombs. And that lawyer said, the biggest threat to nuclear energy is not another accident like 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl, it's lawsuits. And so now you health physicists, you're going to be go into breakout sessions, and you're going to be trained how to be objective scientific witnesses, experts on behalf of the US government to defend against those lawsuits. And so I think this shows you this bond between the only people, almost entirely the only people around, and were already industry scientists who were very, sort of herded to come to certain kinds of conclusions, because otherwise they would be out of jobs.
And actually, like on that, so you speaking about that reminds me of so Marilyn Robinson, the American novelist, has written which you've probably read, an incredibly passionate and eloquent book called Mother Country, which is about the British nuclear industry. She says the industry worldwide is protected by secrecy, and it's by significance in maintaining the prestige of governments, and by its military significance, whether as a licit or illicit supplier of fissile materials or as a potential target. In other words, she said, I do find it fascinating within the research to say that, the nexus of government, which is, you're hitting on really difficult hotspots, which is military might and energy might. Nuclear power is very much within the center of those two strongholds. And so therefore we as ordinary citizens, it's very difficult for us to gain access to those, quite strategic and critical places where those in power want to defend.
Darragh, I saw that there's somebody in the Q&A who she's saying hello as your Chernobyl travel buddy. And so I wondered actually whether, since you wrote the book, you have been there, and if so, what you're in.
Yeah, I was there actually with Adi Roach and the Chernobyl Children's Fund. I didn't make contact with them while I was writing the book, just because I suppose I didn't necessarily want to take a particular side. I wanted to be as free to write about whatever I needed to write about. But afterwards, I did make contact with her, and we did travel to Chernobyl together. And actually, hearing Kate speak about it, the very affecting thing is when you meet people who are undergoing the after effects, even people who weren't born at the time. That kind of human contact is so eloquent in a way that, what you mentioned about, the emphasis is on people who are victims to defend themselves. When you actually become in contact with people, you understand how skewed that is. So we met several people. I remember meeting a couple whose children were suffering from Cockayne syndrome, which is a syndrome that causes premature aging. And this couple weren't born, I think they were born maybe 5 years after Chernobyl happened. So their kids were, born maybe, I think 30 years after Chernobyl, 25 years around the time. But you see a 4 and 5 year old with a prematurely aged face who actually has the face of a 55-year-old. Or you see children in just these in cases of enormous distress, and their distress is so eloquent. And I do find it compelling and interesting. And Svetlana Alexievich is a good example, but even the work of Chernobyl Children's Fund, human suffering is so eloquent. We can use all the science that we need to dismiss whatever is happening, but human suffering is actually the thing that will speak against that.
Linda, you might want to follow up on that, because you're on the ground with that in Belarus. And I think one of the things that fascinated me about your work, when we first got to know each other right before the Nuclear Free Future Award, was what you've done to sort of change the societal approach to these kinds of issues, and the fathers that would leave families because the children were born with birth defects, and trying to sort of get people reintegrated into society. Can you talk a little bit about the stigmas and how you were able to sort of help people overcome that?
Well, we realized very early on that there were a lot of children with disabilities in Belarus, and that many of them were very hidden from society. A lot were in big institutions in the countryside, and where a mother had decided to keep her disabled child, very often the father had left the family because within the Soviet Union, it was regarded as a stigma, a failure. Everything was supposed to be perfect, and if your child was born with disabilities, often the father just wouldn't stay if the mother insisted on keeping the child. But even the mothers who'd kept their children often kept them hidden from people because they were a little bit embarrassed by them and wanted to protect them. So we brought mothers and young children with disabilities for holidays in Britain. And I remember some mothers once in Rogachow telling me that now they were proud of their children because they'd understood that their children were just as worthy as anybody else's children. So they didn't take them out with the hood up on the pushchair and trying to keep them hidden from people. So gradually we've been trying to change attitudes over the years. It was, after all, it was just the same in Britain years ago. So we've done a lot of training programs. We've set up homes for young people with disabilities and helped to promote integrated education. We've had a big foster care training program over the last 20 years. And in more recent years, we've focused on fostering children with disabilities. So that is now starting to happen more. And it's been great to work with the education and social protection departments in Belarus, who have been really keen to change things. So in many ways, they've changed ahead of public opinion. But there's no doubt that there are more children with disabilities because of Chernobyl. And we've been really pleased to be able to be part of helping those children to play a role within society.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Linda. I just wanted to answer. I can do this bit myself. Somebody was asking why we were focusing on Belarus, and I suppose one of the answers to that, unless you want to come in as well, Linda, is this event is specifically about the 35th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster.
Yes, just Belarus is the country which received the heaviest fallout and the worst effects. Northern Ukraine is very contaminated, parts of Russia are very contaminated, but Belarus has the largest area of very significant contamination.
Yes, and on the back of that, actually, Linda, we've been asked if anybody has got any insights into the post-Chernobyl ecological awareness. So I don't know if you want to come back on that and whether Darragh or Kate would like to, and indeed Linda, Pence Gunter would like to come in on that. But Linda, would you like to make a comment?
Ecological awareness, what of the people, of the public? Are they aware?
It just says, I would love to hear any insights you might all have into Slavic or post-Chernobyl ecological awareness. I mean, I don't know whether the people themselves have any ecological awareness. Maybe that would be interesting to know, to hear.
Well, I think people realise that many parts of the country are still very heavily contaminated. There are still lots of areas with radiation signs where you're not supposed to go. People realise that it's not safe to pick mushrooms and berries in those areas. And that's something that's very ingrained in the culture, to gather mushrooms, pick berries, and people like to hunt game. And I'm sure there are still some people within the countryside in Belarus who still do that, and that's one of the major ongoing problems. But I think most people are very aware that some areas are very contaminated, but perhaps try to put out of their minds the fact that a large part of the country still has a certain level of contamination. When you think that in parts of Wales and Cumbria, it was 26 years before the restrictions on the sheep were lifted, so that farmers didn't have to have their sheep checked before they could be sold for us to eat. And our levels of contamination were so small compared to most of Belarus. it must be that in even the lower level of areas, there's still a significant level of contamination. And I would imagine that most people in Belarus would just generally don't think about that anymore, because you can't live your whole life being anxious about the environment around you.
I mean, I think it's probably important to say as well, you know, that radiation is silent, it's invisible, it's tasteless, it's formless, it's odorless. You know, we as a species have not really evolved. You know, a lot of these isotopes that were in the air and spreading in the air in Chernobyl are essentially, first of all, they're like human constructs, but, you know, also we only came up with this engineering about 150 years ago. So the human body, we have not evolved to become aware of the effects of it. So when you're in a region like that, so for example, when I did visit the plant, we stayed just for a couple of hours. We slept in a hunting lodge quite nearby. First thing in the morning, I wake up and I'm ready to start brushing my teeth with the, you know, turn on the tap and use the local water. You know, there is something about it that, because it's, you know, we haven't evolved to be aware or at least our sense, or on a sensory level, aware of the effects of radiation. It is very difficult for people in those areas to continuously keep that in mind. And I think that makes the, you know, in some ways, for people who do want to warn about the effects of radiation, it makes their job harder, because actually the tangibility of it just isn't there. You know, it's there in the evidence, but it's not there in the, you know, in the very visceral kind of sensual aspect.
Thank you, thank you. I should just say at this point that if we don't, we've got lots of questions now. If we don't get a chance to answer everybody's questions, we will take a copy and we will try our very, very best to get answers to you via email. So please don't be disappointed if we can't get to all of your questions. Does anybody on our panel know of any programs of people from Chernobyl and Fukushima? Is there any links? Is the question? Are there any links between the groups of people helping each other with ways to survive, etc.? Do any of them come together? Does anybody have any knowledge of that?
Well, there's been for a long time quite a link between scientists in Japan and in Belarus. It was Japanese scientists who did the first radiation maps, which showed 3 years after the accident that there were areas up to 100 miles from Chernobyl with very high levels of contamination. So there have always been links. And a few years ago, there was an international Chernobyl network set up that involved Friends of the Earth and other groups from Japan. So people were making contacts between those working around Fukushima and people working on Chernobyl. I'm not sure how strong those ongoing links are, but I'm sure there are people who are sharing what's happening in both places. And certainly in Fukushima, there's been quite an incidence of thyroid cancer. So I'm sure that people are discussing that. It's developed in very much the same way as it did around Chernobyl.
Thank you, Linda. This is a question for Kate. Kate, Neil Adams was wondering how did you experience the dilemma of looking at Chernobyl through Western eyes when you were writing your book? And how did you remain objective? Was that a challenge? Was that a challenge in your writing?
I write about that problem, and I spoke about a little bit that you know, when I was first a researcher in the 1980s and the 1990s, you know, I very much bought into this sort of end of history, capitalism is triumphant kind of notions. And that these people in these Chernobyl areas were a bunch of whiners, you know, griping about things that didn't really exist. So, you know, one of the things I try to do in my books is be transparent about how I go about my research, who I talk to, what kinds of records I use. In this project, I followed a forester and a couple of biologists around the zone to try to get an education in how to read landscapes for radioactivity. in order to cross-check the sources I was finding in the archive. And then I do a lot of interviews. So what I guess by the time I started working on this project, I realized that the Western sense of superiority is a problem in bias. And I think by that time I had overcome that I have the ability to take these scientists at face value, that they may not work through peer-reviewed journals in the same way. They might not use the same Western standardized protocols, that they have their own separate sort of knowledge and ways of checking their systems, but that that their science should be looked at as seriously as scientists in the West. And some of the industry scientists who've attacked me, I said, well, you've ignored our work, that all this Chernobyl work we did through the UN, through the International Atomic Energy Agency. But I considered their work, but what I thought was so important about the Soviet archives is that for the first time, the Hiroshima studies began 5 years after the bombing. They started, and some of that data was only started to be gathered 10 years after the bombing, where the Chernobyl records have these scientists on the ground recording in real time the first 5 years after the accident and what's happening to people. And that's really valuable data. We don't have that anywhere else because of military secrecy, because of nuclear, all kinds of problems with nuclear industries. So I think that scientists should go back in and look at those records and take them seriously. That's really the pitch I make in my book. I'm just an historian, but I think scientists can do a lot with that material.
And following on from that, Ray Street asked a question following on. So do you, Kate, or any of our other panelists know if scientists challenged UN bodies, scientists such as Keith Baverstock? Do we know what happened to them? What sort of response?
Yeah, they tried to fire Baverstock, Dr. Baverstock, and he was eventually moved out of his job. Lots of sort of shouting matches and things like that. And so this is what happens, like if you're an industry scientist and then you push against from the inside, if you become a whistleblower basically from the inside and push against the industry. And we have, all kinds of examples of this in the past, Goffman and Alice Stewart and the late Steve Wing. These, they get maligned. They get treated like, oh, this is a scientist who's gone political. You can no longer trust their science. Sorry, Darragh.
I was going to say Yuri Bandashevsky is on that list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Arrested, right? Thrown in jail for 6 years. Yeah.
Well, Darragh, you also perhaps can address that question about coming at it from Western eyes. I mean, I was very struck by the fact that, often a first novel you assume would be something from your own background, your own story, your own history. And I gather you're doing that with your second novel, but you chose this as your first novel, which is a huge amount of research. It's an uphill climb, I'm sure. So how did you kind of approach this idea of coming in, with a critical eye to the crumbling of the Soviet Union, but as obviously a Westerner looking at it from the outside?
Yeah, I was totally intimidated by it. I spent about my first year really boning up on my chemistry. and was writing a lot of really making a very strong attempt to understand the chemistry behind it. And Svetlana Alexievich was one of those people that really began to free me from that and allowed me to just focus on the human situation. Subsequently, though, after I finished my book and actually after visiting Chernobyl, I did, obviously Kate went far further down that road than I did, but I did really began to research a lot of the after effects and a lot of the medical studies that had been published with the intent of speaking about it when my book was published, and found it very difficult to get that across in interviews. People were very willing, interviewers in several countries were very willing to talk about nuclear, the situation as a Soviet problem, but really were very unwilling to get into it. When I was attempting to talk about Sellafield or a lot of the French nuclear industry, the abuses that happen in Cap du Lac, that becomes problematic. That becomes very problematic. Yeah, and my publishers weren't happy about it either.
Thanks, Darragh. Another question. I think we're going to take another couple of questions. I think we're aiming to finish around about 6:30. So I'll take another couple of questions, and then, as I said, any that we haven't managed to get to, apologies for that, but we will try and reply. Neil has got a question for Kate. He wants to know if Kate can talk a bit more about how those without scientific knowledge were and continue to be silenced. So is this still a common phenomenon? I mean, Darragh, you might know about this as well. Is this a common phenomenon when opposing nuclear power? I think I can, as an anti-nuclear campaigner, probably say yes, it is still quite a common phenomenon. So despite the growing recognition of alternative forms of energy production, specifically, Kate, as a historian, how do you address this?
Well, I mean, partly because of liability from potential accidents and health problems resulting from that, but partly just for the sheer technology. Nuclear power is now so far more expensive than gas, oil, and certainly the real winner right now is wind power is cheaper than even gas. Certainly cheaper than way cheaper than nuclear. So Science magazine just last week had an editorial saying nuclear power is done. We just don't see a future for it. If we're going to address climate change, which is why people are advocating nuclear power, we need to address climate change not in 20 years when the next round of reactors can be built, but today. And you can put solar panels on the building I'm sitting in. You could do it in a week, and you could put up wind turbines very quickly, and that's the kind of response. So in terms of money and time and impact on climate, nuclear doesn't make any sense. In terms of the problem that we don't have any solution to long-term storage, nuclear doesn't make any sense. Reactors need to be on bodies of water, and they dot oceanic coasts. We have rising sea levels. For that reason, we're facing a lot of potential hazards in the future from aging power reactors. I teach at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. There's a big nuclear engineering department there, and they don't have many majors because young people aren't interested in nuclear engineering anymore. So who's going to run these reactors? Who's going to manage for the next 1,000 years the radioactive waste problems that come from those reactors? So in so many levels, the future of nuclear power doesn't make much sense. I mean, whether we should close reactors that are running now, sooner rather than later, that's something debatable. I think maybe we should wait and run them as safely as we can until we have alternatives. But Germany has taken an alternative course, and their alternative sources of energy have really kicked in more quickly because they shut down those reactors. So I think that's debatable. But certainly as for a future, I mean, it's not just me saying that. When Science magazine says that, I think the writing's on the wall.
Yes, thank you. I think what we'll do is I'd like to bring both Lindas, Linda Pence Gunter and Linda Walker in, maybe on that, to round us off and to talk about what is being done, what campaigners are doing at the moment, and where the work is being carried out, and how important it is for people to still be involved with the anti-nuclear power campaigns and issues. So if Linda Walker and Linda Pence Gunter, would you mind coming in and helping us to finish off on a high note, and the fact that there's still some more work to be done, please?
Well, I'm sure Linda's got a lot more than me to say on anti-nuclear power campaigning, but certainly all my experience with the effects of Chernobyl makes it absolutely abundantly clear that nuclear cannot be the answer for the future. And some of the things that Kate has mentioned, it takes so long to produce, it's so expensive, it's so vulnerable to the effects of climate change. It's a terrorist target, a cyber target. There is just no logical reason to support the building of new nuclear power stations. So everybody is now grasping at, oh, well, let's make these little small modular nuclear reactors then. They're cheaper and quicker to make, but they would have to be very local. And who wants a small modular nuclear reactor on their housing estate or in their town? Completely lunatic idea. And all the money that's being put into that needs to be put into renewables and finding better storage for renewables, and into reducing energy consumption. So nuclear cannot in any way be any part of the answer to our future.
Well, Jackie, I think you've just suggested a great subject for another webinar, because that's a long, that's a big topic. So I'm not going to go into all the many reasons that I think a lot of our audience members are already familiar with, other than to say that you need to do the cheapest, fastest energy technology to reduce the most carbon quickly. And we're in a climate crisis, and that rules out nuclear right from the get-go. So it's a non-starter from a time and economics point of view, even before you get into all the other reasons like waste and security and safety and so forth. But what I will say, just to wrap up, because it was really the genesis for doing this particular program, is that I think as soon as you put the human face on this story, as soon as you hear the personal narratives, as soon as you see the people who've been affected by this, not just from a nuclear accident like Chernobyl, but from the first day that uranium is extracted from the ground till the last moment where we don't know what to do with it and where to store it, there are human faces to that story. And they are suffering, and they have not got any of the so-called benefits like turning the lights on with this electricity, and they've taken the brunt of the harm. And as soon as you tell those stories, it becomes really hard, I think, for the nuclear deniers. They don't talk about these people, they don't debate these people, they don't sit in the same table with these people. They can't, because if they do that, their lives fall apart, you know. So the more we can tell stories like this, I think, the more effective we can be. And we saw that in the dramatization of Chernobyl. We saw that in reading the real stories from Svetlana's book, from finding out the true information from Kate's book, and from living with the characters in Darragh's book. And I think all those approaches are really effective. So I would just encourage people to keep looking at the human side of this. You know, the technical part's important, but keep telling the people's stories. And I really appreciate all of you coming on today, and Maxine, who had to leave us earlier, and to you, Jackie and Linda and Sean, for helping to organize this wonderful event, and for all of you who've shared it with us, because I think it's a really important message, and it has been recorded, so you can watch it again. We will send the link around afterwards so you can see it if you missed any part of it or want to pick up on something that was said today. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'd like to mirror that as well. I think it's been a very good event, and there have been comments in the Q&A box about how much people have enjoyed it. So as I said, we weren't able to get to absolutely everybody's questions, but hopefully we'll be able to pick those up. Sean, I don't know if you wanted to, just before we finish, just mention the webinar that you mentioned right at the beginning, just as an extra reminder to people, because that would be fantastic if people could join that. Could you give us the details again, Sean, please?
Yes, yeah, I put it on the Q&A, so that the link to it is on that. It's been organised by the German state of Baden-Württemberg and the International Nuclear Risk Awareness Group and the Alliance of Regions for Phasing Out Nuclear Power in Europe, and we're a partner with them. Go on our website as well, which is www.nuclearpolicy.info as well. Amongst the speakers are the former German and American heads of the nuclear regulators there, and many of the great academic speakers in this field, really. The focus of the event is looking at the fact that we have over 125 nuclear reactors, which are over 30, 35, some over 40 years old around the world, and what would happen if any of those had a fault with them because of their age, really. So it's looking at the aging nature of nuclear reactors and the real need to start to close them as quickly as possible, really. We very much encourage people to go. There's already a lot of people on it as well. And as I said, if you want to get the website, it's on the Q&A on this call as well. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you, Darragh. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Linda Walker and Linda Pence Gunter and Sean. Thank you very much. We're going to leave it there. And I hope you'll all agree that it's been just a wonderful event. So thank you very much.
Thank you.